we are now recording. So I'd like to welcome Barbara Rubel. Barbara, thank you so much for being here this evening. It is, what is it? It is Tuesday, June 2nd in 2020. And I'd like to do a quick little introduction about Barbara. Viktor Frankl said, quote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves," end quote. As suicide loss survivors, we are challenged by this devastating loss, and we have been changed by it. This webinar brings suicide loss survivors together to recognize that there is a common thread woven through our stories of loss. That's what our speaker will focus on during today's program, those things that complicate our grief and how to manage it. Our speaker's personal story was featured in an Emmy award-winning documentary, Fatal Mistakes, Families Shattered by Suicide. She is a speaker and contributing writer in several books about traumatic loss. The third revised and updated edition of her book, But I Didn't Say Goodbye, Helping Families After Suicide, was just launched. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Rubel. So welcome, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So share a little bit about your personal story.
My story, well, come back with me to 1986. I'm in the hospital and I am pregnant, and my husband walked into the room and told me that my father killed himself. And I was in the hospital because I was pregnant with triplets. And so my father ended his life right before I was about to give birth to 3 little baby boys. And it changed my life. I couldn't believe that my father would not be grandpa. He was a loving, fabulous guy. I loved my dad. He had deteriorating discs in his back, and his suicide note said he couldn't stand the pain anymore. So he ended his life. And he did it at a time when there was so much joy in my life, bringing home 3 healthy babies from the hospital. And people telling me about my father's funeral or the wake or what that was like, because I couldn't attend. I was in the hospital. So it was a difficult time because in one lane, I'm exhausted from taking care of 3 babies, but filled with joy. And in the other lane, I'm grieving a man who I love dearly, his death by suicide. It was an unbelievable time in my life, but it changed the trajectory of my life. It got me involved in suicide postvention. I facilitated a suicide loss survivor support group over 25 years ago. I got involved with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the American Association of Suicide. I couldn't do enough to help other survivors, and it helped me to heal. Helping others helped me to understand what I was going through, because I didn't think anybody could understand the pain of loss, especially a father killing himself right before you're about to give birth. It was just really, really hard. But the way I really healed was just through other survivors, because they get it. In my support group, I was facilitating the group 20 years ago, but I was getting just as much out of it as they were. It's an amazing thing when we come together. It really is.
So Marilyn, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I'm on the phone.
Okay, yes, I have Marilyn Koenig on the phone. So I just welcome, Marilyn. Welcome to our webinar.
Oh, thank you. I'm so sorry, but I didn't have a heads up that Zoom has to be updated.
No, it's okay. I think a lot of us have had that happen. But I did introduce Barbara, and she just told us a little bit about when her father had taken his life.
Yeah, I was listening.
Okay, all right. So did you have some specific questions that are, I'll go ahead and hand the conversation over to you.
No, just go ahead with Barbara, what you were talking about. That's fine.
Oh, all right. Okay.
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 Basically, in sharing your story, it's called a loss narrative. And in sharing that story with other suicide loss survivors, we learn from one another. We learn how to cope. We learn how to manage our feelings. We learn that this thing called grief is painful, and that there's an emotional reaction, a physical reaction, a cognitive reaction, a behavioral reaction, a spiritual reaction. And when you add all those reactions up, you realize you're not going crazy, you're perfectly normal, and it's called grief.
Mhm.
And when you experience grief by suicide, it could be very disenfranchised because society doesn't want to talk to you about it. They're afraid of you. It could be complicated, and it moves to a place when someone dies, you really sometimes expect it. They maybe had cancer or AIDS, which can also be a little bit disenfranchised. But when someone takes their own life, it is sudden, it is unexpected, and it is traumatic. So what we're experiencing is not only a complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, but traumatic loss. And our brains can't handle that. It's so confusing because we can't grasp that our loved one actually took their own life. We can't believe that they would do something like that. And why didn't they come to us? That was one of the first things I asked, like, why didn't Daddy come to me? I would have, yes, I was in the hospital about to give birth with triplets, but I still would have done anything I could to save him. And people have said to me, well, did you know your father was crazy? That is the most insulting.
Oh,
I don't even know how to respond to that. Or they'll say, okay, I'll share with you another thing that happened. I'm a keynote speaker. I do trainings. And I was doing a keynote address for mental health professionals, and I was on the stage, and I was done with my keynote, and I still had my lavalier mic on, and people were clapping, and I said, thank you very much. And at that moment, someone came up onto the stage, right into my face and said, Barbara, that was a great keynote. Thank you so much for coming to this mental health congress, but you do know your father's in hell.
Oh.
oh,
My.
Okay.
Oh my.
So I'm a paid speaker, so I can't punch her in the face because
Yeah.
then I wouldn't get paid, right? So what do
I can't
you
believe that? That's
Oh my God! What do you do with that? And I'm also a pastoral bereavement coordinator. I work with the church and synagogues and mosques because I'm a grief specialist. And I just said, God bless you. So she left the stage. And then when I walked off the stage, I had all these social workers and therapists and clinicians who needed to come up to me and tell me my father was not in hell. So they were lined up out the door. Barbara, your father is not in hell. Barbara, your father's not in hell. Barbara, by the time I got to the 30th person, I started to feel like, what is going on here? So people do say the wrong things, and we are never ready for it, no matter what. So we are continually throughout our lifetime bombarded with people who do the wrong thing, who say the wrong thing. So we need to surround ourselves with healthy, like-minded people, and many are suicide loss survivors. They get it. I can't tell you, when I meet a suicide loss survivor, they need to hug me. It's an amazing thing because we get it. We get the pain. We understand the anger, the bitterness, the sorrow. We get it. And I think that's why I became a thanatologist. A thanatologist is a specialist in death, dying, and bereavement. I went back to school for my master's in this because I wanted to learn how to truly help other survivors heal. And I didn't want it to be my opinion. I wanted to know, what does the research say? What are the mourning theories? And so many survivors think that there are stages that they have to go through. First this stage, that, and now I'm going crazy because I went back to the first stage. There are no stages. There is so many other ways of looking at this. There's one model that I love. It's called continuing bonds model. We do not have to sever the ties with our loved ones. We do not have to throw away their clothes. We do not have to never mention their name again. We continue the bond with them in a spiritual way. That's my favorite one. There's also one by Niemeyer, Bob Niemeyer, which is called Meaning Reconstruction. That's also one of my favorites because we find meaning in the loss. We find meaning in the relationship. We reconstruct our life and our loss narrative based on the relationship that we shared and find meaning in it. And you could have negative meaning, but you can also have like positive meaning. And for me, it's valuing life. It's being closer to my family. It's more spiritual. I'm more spiritual after his suicide. So these models of mourning help you to manage the loss, cope with your time of bereavement, and mourn in a healthy way. So
yeah, that's one thing I was going to ask you about is, my dad died of natural causes a year and a half before I lost my cousin to suicide. And so I went through the typical stages, you just mentioned the stages of grief, and man, that just went out the window after I lost him. And so I appreciate you touching on that. But you said something about you've done a lot of research with loss survivors. So what have you found, or share some of that, what you found interesting? And
I found that there is a common thread woven through all the stories. The question of why. Why did my dad kill himself? Why did my dad kill himself right before giving birth to triplets? Is there a good time to kill yourself? There's no good time. So we can't make sense out of this act that is incomprehensible. We just can't understand it. But what I tell people is that when a suicide loss survivor says, why did my daughter kill herself? Why did my husband die by suicide? Why? We don't need you to answer us. We don't need you to say, well, there's a correlation between depression and suicide, or, perhaps this. We don't need you to tell it. We know. We'll never have an answer. The answer's in his head and he's dead. So we don't need you, but we need you to acknowledge that we need to keep asking why. It's part of our process. That's, I think, the most critical. Also, the sudden nature of it, and sometimes the violent nature of it, that it can wake us up in the middle of the night. We make up these own pictures in our head, and sometimes it's worse than what it actually was. So it's good to perhaps talk to a coroner, talk to the funeral director, talk to a doctor, give them the report and say, explain this to me, because sometimes what we think happened was much, much, much worse. And that could really weigh heavy on the heart.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I usually, this is Marilyn, but I usually also encourage people, if they haven't, if they think they're going to read the autopsy, to have somebody with them. Don't read it by yourself. Have a good friend, a good family member that would be there with you.
Absolutely,
so,
Marilyn. Thank you for sharing that.
Have some caution about, plan that and use some caution about that, because sometimes we can't think clearly, so we wouldn't think to do that. We just think, well, I should read this, and may it sit there for 6 months or a year, and then you decide to read it.
I didn't read my father's report until 5 years later. 5 years later, because I just couldn't. It would seal the fact that he really is dead. There are tasks of grief, and that's one of the tasks. Like the first task is to accept the reality of the loss. How could I accept the reality of the loss if I'm not even attending his funeral? How could my father didn't die? How could my father be dead? So I needed tangible things. I needed to see maybe a photo of the grave. I needed to hear what they said about the funeral, because I didn't attend it. So you need to find ways to accept the reality that your loved one is actually gone. And then you need to process the pain, and not to do it through alcohol or drugs. But you can't get through grief without experiencing and processing that painful loss. And it is heart-wrenching. It is sometimes, there could be an upsurge of great grief where you're just at the kitchen sink washing dishes, and then you fall to the floor, you're hysterical crying, and then you just get up and continue washing the dishes. So you accept the loss, you process the pain, and then you have to, and the third task is to adjust to the world where your loved one is missing. They go missing. They're there one day, and the next day they're gone. And to adjust to that world is not an easy thing. And that's why it's goal-centric, and you have to really focus in on what can you do to realize that I have to accept this, I have to process the pain, I have to adjust to it. But the fourth task is to find an enduring connection with them, spiritual connection, because just because my father's dead does not mean that he's no longer in my life. I look at pictures, I eat his food and hold it up to heaven and say, oh, Dad, you would have loved these tomatoes. He's still very much a part of my life.
So you weren't able, were you able to attend his, did they have a service for your dad?
Yeah, but I was in the hospital. I gave birth 3 weeks later. So
Oh, okay.
I was in labor. And so everyone was at the funeral, the wake. I mean, I did nothing. And then 3 weeks later, my mom, after the babies were born, she said, we're going to have a party. And I said, we're gonna what? And she said, when you come home, we are going to have a party. And I said, Mom, when I get out of this hospital, I want to grieve Daddy's death. And she said, you're a mom of triplets now. Daddy would want you to have a party. So it's just like when I gave birth, people came to the hospital and they handed me balloons and cards and said, I just saw the triplets in the row. You have the whole first row. So sorry about your dad's suicide. In the same breath. So am I smiling? Am I crying? I don't even know how to feel. So it's not easy. No one's story, no one's lost narrative is easy, but we do have this common thread of asking why, deep sorrow, angst for our loved one. I mean, I wrote my book. You know, my book is But I Didn't Say Goodbye, helping families after a suicide. And the reason why I said, but I didn't say goodbye, is because people said, oh, he was such a great guy. You had such a good relationship. You know, you had fun times, but I didn't say goodbye. That's the bottom line. And we need that. We need to be able to hold our loved one's hand in their last ebbing breath. I was a hospice bereavement coordinator for several years. And I got to tell you, being present when people are terminally ill and dying and they have the opportunity to have a passage of the New Testament being read, or I brought in a harpist, or the children at the bedside holding the loved one's hand, I would sometimes cry from happiness for them. And they thought I was crying because they thought it was sad. And I thought, how joyous. They had this opportunity to say goodbye to their loved one. And we don't get that. We don't get that goodbye. And that really breaks our heart.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that, this is Marilyn again, the other thing that is hard, I think, to deal with personally is the fact that they died alone and violent, most of the time violent. And that just breaks your heart to think they were contemplating and doing this violence, and nobody's there with you. There's nobody to help you. There's nobody to encourage you. And, you know, I guess we wanted to be there so we could say, no, you know, let's think about this, or let's wait a bit. And, you know, I guess we wanted to stop it. That's why we wish we could have been there. But yeah. I think we probably all picture this person all by themselves dying.
That's what they wanted. That's what they wanted. That they made sure that they were alone. They made sure that so we wouldn't tell them not to do it, or take the gun out of my father's hand, or the rope away from your child, or whatever it is that made them die. They knew we would stop it, and they wanted to die alone. And for us, because we love them, we can't wrap our minds around that. We just can't. And that's why it's confusing, and that's why we need each other, and that's why we need support groups to go around the room and to hear the stories, and they resonate in each and every one of us, and we shake our heads because, yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Wow, I'm not alone. I'm not going crazy. This is normal. This is, grief is normal. The DSM is now making it complicated. It's going to be a new complicated disorder, or it's going to be called prolonged grief disorder, no longer persistent complex. But the bottom line is, grief is just a painful experience. Our loved ones ended their lives. We miss them. We are sad. They go missing. I mean, what I asked in my group years ago, I said, give me just one word how you feel. And everyone went around the room and they just said, sad. sorrow, because we have a lot of words to describe our grief, but that's the bottom line. We're just so sad they're gone, sad that they're missing out on life, sad that they didn't come to us, sad that they didn't have the strength to stay alive, that tomorrow might have been a better day. It's just so sad.
Yeah, I remember sitting in the back of the car and somebody was driving us home and thinking to myself, if he'd only waited till the sun came up the next day, if he'd only waited till morning and the sun would come up, maybe that would have kept him going. You know, it's like, and because, you know, he died at night. I mean, he did this at night, so it was like, here it was morning, and if he'd only waited till morning, it's just like, it's really, but you know, grief is a very healthy response to a person that has loving, caring thoughts and caring feelings about somebody else. And if we didn't grieve, if we don't grieve, I mean, I think that's unhealthy. It's a healthy thing to grieve and be sad when somebody dies. And depending on how they die, circumstances in their relationship and everything, it affects us differently because of our own relationship and our own personality.
Yeah, but we also have to recognize that there are instrumental grievers and intuitive grievers. There's no right or wrong griever. So I'm an instrumental griever. And what that means is that I'm a doer. I'm the one who needed to write a book. I'm the one who needed to get on a board of directors. I'm the one who needed to do something to get whatever it was for starting a suicide loss support group. That's the instrumental grievers, and we're not criers. We're still grieving. Our feelings are intense, but they're held within. We're more thinkers. And then there's intuitive grievers, and they're the ones who are criers. They emote, their expression, they are right out there with their grief. And very often, when you see an instrumental griever like me, who's not a crier, you'll think something's wrong, like she's not grieving. We are grieving, we all just grieve in our own way. And they used to call it masculine grief, but it's not gender related. It's simply, you're either an intuitive griever, instrumental griever, and however you grieve, that's okay. It's okay.
Yes.
I wanted to go ahead and open up for questions. If any of you that are here on the webinar this evening, just go ahead and type your question. If you scroll down to the bottom of your page, you can open up the, either click on participants or you click on the Q&A. I believe, yeah, you just click on the participants. And you can see on the right that I've posted a few things that Barbara has mentioned as we've been moving along in our conversation. So go ahead and post your questions right now, and then we'll get them answered here shortly. So Marilyn, did you have a particular question or comment?
Yeah, tell us about the books you've written and kind of how that all came about. So, because you've written more than one, right?
Well, I wrote it's a course book, a 30-hour continuing education course book for nurses. And it's called Loss, Grief, and Bereavement, Helping Individuals Cope. And there is a chapter on suicide in there, but it's also homicide and palliative care and hospice and compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, soup to nuts, helping communities in crisis. And so I wrote that for nurses. I'm also in other chapter books, but my favorite is But I Didn't Say Goodbye, Helping Families After a Suicide, because what that story is, it's so different than the first two editions. What I did through the years is listen to all these suicide loss survivor stories and incorporated everything I learned from myself and from others into the characters in the book. And so all the mourning theories, like the little boy loses his daddy, he's 11 years old, and he loses his daddy, and how he, like, it's the dual process model where he is crying for his daddy, he misses his father, he wails for him, and then you see how he goes out an hour later and plays with his friend So he's oscillating. He goes back and forth from doing the grief work and then moving away from it. And it just, all the models are just incorporated into the story to teach the reader that there are different ways to grieve. There are different ways to continue the bond, to understand that you're not alone, that it's all about family and friends and community and faith. And the story itself, it's not for children, it's a book for adults, and it's a real book for, especially if you're a clinician who wants to help a suicide loss survivor, because I've heard too many stories from suicide loss survivors who've gone to a clinician who are either working just on the stage-based model, or they don't know how to help someone who's grieving. They think that they're depressed, and you're not suffering from clinical depression, you are grieving. And but I didn't say goodbye. If you are a survivor, there's a Kindle version now. I actually came into the 21st century and we have Kindle, and I just hope you read it and share it or give it to your library. That's what I'm hoping, is that every survivor buys the book and just donates it to the library, because so many survivors cannot afford to purchase a book. And so I just, if you can purchase it, read it, and then give it to your library, or to a support group, that would be great.
I went ahead and typed the name of the book. It's over on the right-hand side for all of you. You're welcome. And we do have a question from Jonathan. So Jonathan says, Barbara, I think you really nailed so many of the common feelings and reactions we have to the violent and unexpected death by suicide to a loved one. In helping those who are survivors and being there for them, what different approach would you take for those who have never really acknowledged and worked through their grief, as opposed to those whose grief is fresh?
Well, if you've never worked through your grief, there's a reason for that. Maybe there could be other issues. There are like comorbid factors. There are other issues involved. And it might just be something where it's too stressful for you to do so. There might be other losses that you have not focused in on. And maybe if you focus in on this loss by suicide, then you'll have to realize that maybe your mother also died by suicide, your cousin died by suicide. So you have to realize why it's so painful. And it might be a comforting hand not to address it. We don't have to address it. If someone's not addressing it and they're okay, then they're okay. We can't judge how they want to approach their loss. Now we take someone who's recently lost. You have to go very, very slow with someone who's a brand new bereaved individual. This is a new world for them. Their world is shattered. They had this basic assumptive world and it is gone. They were attached to this person and that bond was severed. So you have to just see where they are. And even though, like, I know the theories, I'm a thanatologist, I'm a specialist in sudden death, I don't go there with the person. I'm simply going to listen to their narrative, and I listen for the metaphor. I think if I'm going to share anything that could really benefit you today, I would say when you meet someone for the first time, deeply listen for the metaphor. Are they saying, I can't believe this happened. I feel like I'm on a roller coaster ride, or I feel like I'm drowning. Then what you can do is say, wow, it feels like you can't even keep your head above water. Yes, that's right. You see how just the metaphor, like I have this thing called the Pallet of Grief. And it's in one of the books, but if anybody wants it, they just email me at barbararubel@barbararubel.com and I will get you the Pallet of Grief, because therapists use it across the country. It's used in support groups. And when my father died, I was in the middle of drawing, like when I came home at night, I was up with 3 babies. So between feedings, I would do some watercolor painting. And at one point, my palm hit the glass and the painting was covered with water and it was ruined. And I was crying because the painting got ruined, and I'm not a crier, I'm an instrumental griever. So what was that like? I realized in that moment that my grief was like a palette of grief, blending all these colors. It wasn't angry, sad, whatever all those feelings were, emotions, cognitions. it was just a blend of colors. So I created this palette of grief. And so if anyone wants that palette, it's a creative process to see, are you in a physical griever, an emotional griever, a spiritual griever? And then you could respond to that by just looking at the words you put on the palette and the colors of the palette. So I'd be more than happy to send that to you.
I love that. That's amazing. I'm going to email you right after and get that from you.
Great.
So we can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question, Barbara, because sometimes we do have people that have just given birth to their own child, or shortly afterwards, within a month or two, they're having a baby, and they talk about how hard it is. I'm supposed to be happy because of this new child, this new baby, and yet I've got this grief.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's got to be a really difficult thing. That's a unique thing as compared to having a suicide death, and you're not also having this joyous event at the same almost the same time. It would also probably apply to family weddings that happen to be already scheduled, and they happen around the same time as suicide death. That's a real balancing act for yourself as far as trying to have a healthy, grieving, sad response, but also, I mean, how do you balance that out? I mean, how did you balance triplets?
Yeah.
I mean, which is even I was single birth, so I don't know. But triplets to me would be so consuming that I would find it hard to even be there, either not be there for them or not for me, for my own grief. I mean, what a challenge.
A challenge, 3 challenges. Yes, it was a definite challenge. But your heart is filled with love when you give birth. You love your children. I loved my dad. So although I was grieving his loss and I missed him terribly, I promised myself that I would talk about him to the children, like they got to know him just through storytelling. I would say what grandpa would have done, this or that. But it is really hard. But I think we have to just focus in on what makes us resilient. How do we kind of bounce back to a normal kind of life when our assumptive world is shattered? And we have to look at our greatest strengths. And my greatest strength, Marilyn, is love of learning. I love learning. So I want to read as much as I can about grief. I want to read as much as I can about the afterlife. I want to read as much as I can about whatever it is, the tools and strategies that are going to get me through it. For someone else, their greatest strength might be creativity. So they're journaling, they're doing artwork, they're listening to music. The research, the latest research on coping with grief and stress is to look for moments of awe. And when I just recently, because I'm working on a webinar for nurses, and when I saw that, I was like, moments of awe, that's what's going to help me with my grief. But what the research shows is that if we step outside and we're in a garden, or we're looking at a mountain, or we're looking up at the sunshine, we know we're not alone, that there are other suicide loss survivors doing the same thing, that they're looking up to the heavens, or praying in their garden, or planting something that they know is going to grow. So moments of awe, it could be inspiring and healing. It's quite simple because we're human, and it really is simple to just say, what can I do today, right today, in the moment, to manage my intense feeling? And it might be journaling, it might be calling a friend, it might be praying to God, or it might be just sitting in a corner and crying and letting it out. There's no right or wrong way. Whatever way you're doing it is the right way.
So Barbara, you had mentioned that you reading and learning new things. So you did say something about the afterlife. So did you do reading about that? Did you research that?
Absolutely.
So tell us about, what did you find, or give us your opinion. What do you think?
Well, I believe that my father is in heaven, especially when that woman told me in front of everyone that my father was in hell. It really struck a chord in me because for years, especially I'm not Catholic, but the Catholic Church, had certain rules in place, and the king going back even farther. There is such disenfranchisement in our grief that I needed to know my dad was okay. That's all I wanted. It was a simple word. Are you okay? And I reached out to God. I prayed that he was okay and to send me signs. And he did. Because I'm a keynote speaker, I travel on the plane a lot. Not right now, but usually I'm on a plane going somewhere. And I'll just say, Dad, send me a sign. Let me know, this is a suicide conference or whatever. Let me know you're with me. And a pigeon will walk through the airport. Just walk right by me. My father loved pigeons. He used to raise them in Coney Island. And I was like, yep, that's a sign. So I think not only looking at the afterlife, but looking at spirituality and finding the connections that they're still very much a part of your life. Like maybe a light flickers and you'll say, oh, that was my son. They're still here with us. They don't just die and disappear. Their spirit is still with us. They're watching over us. When I had my support group, at the end of the group, I'd say, everybody just put your hand on your shoulder. That's your loved one saying, I'm with you. And it was so meaningful that, I had a room full of criers, because we just knew that our loved ones were still there. So whether we're talking about the afterlife or faith or God or religion or spirituality, our loved ones are with us, and that brings us comfort. Brings me comfort.
Do you also have a book for children, though?
But I didn't say goodbye was once for children, but now it's for adults. Yeah, but I didn't say goodbye. This is the 3rd edition. Oh my God.
So the first edition was a children's book.
Yes, it was. Yes. And it was a small
book. It was for the parents to read, and you had a project after each chapter, right?
That's right. Yeah, Marilyn, that's 20 years ago.
I know, but that's still a good book.
Yes. And then the second book I added to it, but the 3rd book is when I became I have a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and a Master's in Community Health with a concentration in thanatology. So I took all that education and incorporated into the part 1 to teach you about mourning theories, and then part 2 to just take that child's story and just make you realize, wow, all the things that this kid and his family are going through, going the walk of darkness and joining an American Foundation for Suicide Prevention or whatever. It's what we do through the characters in the book. We're very similar, even though we're very different.
Right. But I'm concerned then, the first edition isn't strictly for parents to work with their children anymore.
Yeah, but it's not even out there anymore. Yeah, it was.
Well, it is in my book.
Oh, I'm going to send you the 3rd edition.
Well, no, but we have it on a recommended list of for things. Is there's so little literature out there for children and families about suicide and how to be a parent with your child and so on, and that's one of them that there is there. And it seems to me that there'd be a market for that original book just as it was.
Yeah, but the Dougie Center, they have wonderful material for children and suicide. Also Centering Corp and Compassion Books, other organizations. But if you have any questions about children and grief, it's the Dougie Center. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I have their things too, but I don't know. I liked your format.
Well, it's the same exact format, but what's changed is there's still many chapters, but at the end of the chapter, there are questions that you could ask yourself based on what the character in the book experienced. And then the character who's 11 years old, he comes back at the end of each chapter 10 years later as a 21-year-old man, reflecting on what it was like as a child who grieves. So,
yeah. Well, we have a board member who has had kind of that experience as a 12-year-old when his father died, and then it's years later when he's an adult that he really has zeroed in on the grieving. He did grieve, yes, but it's a different kind of grief now. And we've had people who were even younger than that And sometimes that's why the grieving is delayed, is because if they're very young, they can't express it. And if you take 20 or 30 years ago, parents didn't even talk about it.
That's right.
So the kids were left to nothing. Nobody talked about it, and they never had the experience, and now they get to be adults, and so now is the time that they learn what really happened, and then they start their grieving then. So
they grieve like a child. Yeah, because it was so different.
So that's kind of what happens with delayed grieving oftentimes.
Yes. Absolutely.
For the child. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and it's like they're grieving as a child, because they weren't allowed to grieve. They weren't allowed to attend the funeral or the services. So now as an adult, they're childlike in that, and that's very normal. Children need to be a part of the rituals of death. They need to be told the truth. If you have a child that knew, maybe it was grandpa or an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or sister or whatever, they must be told the truth at a developmentally correct level. You don't have to get into detail. You don't have to explain the gory details, but you need to be honest. Otherwise, later on, they're going to be re-victimized because they're going to think they did something wrong, or you didn't love them enough or whatever. But be honest with kids. Very important.
Well, and I tell parents, one reason to be honest is if you're not honest with them, and later on they find out that you haven't been honest with you, then they're not going to trust you. Exactly. And trust is a big important thing between parents and children. If you can't trust your parents, then that's a big gap in your growth. So that's one of the important things is to be honest. So you also model honesty with them.
Right, and then if you model that, then they'll see you cry. They'll say it's okay. Right. I see what she's doing or he's doing. Oh, I could do that too. I can cry too. It gives everyone permission to share their loss. And I think we try to protect our children, but you're not protecting them. You're hurting them by not being honest.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you can cry together, and I sometimes suggest, make it their favorite food and say, remember, this used to be my dad's favorite meal. I'm so glad we're having it tonight.
That's what I do.
Let the kids say something to you. I mean, then they'll start responding to that, and you will be able to grieve together and make new memories, or help them to remember, like we did with the triplets. You had to share stories with them in order for them to get to know their grandpa. Mm-hmm. It's so important. It really is.
Keeping memories alive. It's a beautiful thing. Talking about our loved ones, sharing our stories, our lost narratives, helping each other find meaning in those stories, continuing those bonds. Hello, it's a great thing. I think.
Yeah, a healthy thing.
It is a healthy thing.
Very good for all of us.
Yeah. But we're in so much pain, and the world doesn't get it. They'll never understand the depth of the pain. And I hate when I say, my father ended his life, and they give me a look like, oh, really? And I kind of step back. Like, people can't even accept the words. So I think it's important to remember who you share that with. Make sure they can contain it and not say something stupid, because people say something stupid.
Yeah, it's not the truth. Well, we've got about 9 more minutes left, so I wanted to invite the people that have attended this evening to go ahead and post, if you have any additional questions, comments, or thoughts, go ahead and post those now, and we will get those answered for you.
And you could always reach out to me at Barbara Rubel at barbararubel.com, and my website is griefworkcenter.com, griefworkcenter.com, griefworkcenter.com.
Yeah, and I went ahead and typed that over on the right-hand side so you guys can see all of that. And I'll include that information also in our little post-webinar follow-up to all of you as well. So I don't have any, looks like I don't have any other questions. So what's going on like right now? So we've heard like everything, gosh, that you went through with losing your dad. So what's on the horizon? You've just updated your book
Mm-hmm.
and you're working on something for nurses, you said.
Yeah, I do a lot of webinars. I've been doing a lot of webinars for social workers and clinicians. My specialty now is called vicarious trauma. And what that means is these professionals are experiencing not the primary trauma. We, as suicide loss survivors or homicide co-victims, or just people who have experienced trauma and loss, we experience the primary trauma. But professionals are experiencing vicarious trauma. So my specialty now is helping them manage vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, job burnout, because they're leaving the jobs that they love. They can't hear one more story. They can't facilitate one more suicide loss support group. So my goal is to teach them about how to build their resiliency, how to find strengths, and how to find meaning in life and cope with their very stressful career. That's what I'm doing.
Wow, it's amazing. Well,
that is amazing.
Yeah, there's a lot of that needed right now.
Oh, it's an amazing thing because I'm a suicidologist. So my specialty is suicide postvention. So I'm doing a lot of webinars and podcasts and radio on that. But I'm also a thanatologist. And so people just want to talk about the world. The entire world is grieving. And my keynotes are on vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. And we are all experiencing that. So I am so busy with these 3 different lanes because the world is going to hell. Yeah. I mean, seriously, I don't even know how to explain it, but I miss doing my keynotes. I miss being on stage and being with the trainings and doing all I do. But I think these webinars that I've been doing, they're reaching a lot of people and hopefully they're helping. So God bless.
No. Are your webinars listed on your website that people?
No, because they're not they're not mine. They're through national organizations.
Oh, okay. So it's not something that's like.
But if you go onto LinkedIn, if you LinkedIn with me, I do post some of them that are from podcasts and radio shows. But the actual webinars, they're through like National Organization of Nurses or social workers. So they wouldn't be the public, yeah. But link in with me, and then you could see some of them that I posted at least 10 just last week. Posted a lot last week. Yeah, webinar, video, podcast. I have no idea what all these things are. I just put my earphones on and blah blah blah.
Gosh.
Blah 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 a lot.
Well, I'll include if people are on LinkedIn, I will include that link as well. And you just do a quick follow-up email after the webinar. I'll include that as well, because any resource, we're all, I've shared before, anything that I always learn something talking to somebody new, like hearing you this evening. I learned something new. Anything that we listen to has something in there that's meant for us to hear. So we try to provide as many resources to our survivors that we can, and I think that would be a great thing to tap into and see what you've got going on. So that's wonderful. Well, I don't have any other final questions. Marilyn, do you have a final closing question or thought?
Well, I just want to thank Barbara so much for being involved in. She remembers how we met. Can you tell me again, Barbara? Share with us, because I don't remember meeting you. I knew I met you somewhere, but
yeah, no, it was at an American Association of Suicidology conference. It was so many years ago. Herb Hendon was at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. It was so many years ago. It's like 30 years ago, because I remember you saying, because my father died in '86. And you said your son died in '83 or '84. And I said, it's only a couple of years. And I remember saying that to you, that it was only a couple of years. That's what stuck in my head. And now we're in 2020.
Yeah. My son died in '77. So if I said something about a couple of years, that would have been a couple of years after I started Friends for Survival, which was '83.
That's what it was.
tears came in. Because
That's what
in the first couple of years, I was just crying all the time.
Yes.
I didn't even know about AS, and I didn't even want to know anything about suicide because I thought it was so horrid that I just didn't feel like I could learn anything and that would be helpful. I was just sobbing.
Yes,
Just
and
sobbing
look
a
at you
lot.
30 years later. 30 years later,
Yeah, well,
you
30.
and I are still here, and
Yeah.
we're sharing the story of our loved ones' loss. People are learning from that they're not alone. You know, some things will resonate with them, and some things they'll say, I don't believe that, and that's okay. Just we're here, we're together. That's what's
Right,
so great
right.
about knowing we are not alone.
Right. And the value of peer support to me is just immeasurable. You just can't even begin to measure that. There's no price to it. It's just the sharing of a common experience. It's true about cancer, and it's true about a lot of other things too. It's hard for us. It's hard to relate to something that's very, very unique that not everybody experiences, and that's why the peer support for families after a suicide, or family or friends after a suicide death, is so important.
Yeah.
Because it's not something that is common knowledge. But I mean, that's true about homicide victims too. You know, their families.
Yeah, I'm a consultant with the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime. And so I help victim advocates help those who have experienced a homicide. And that particular type of loss is so horrendous because someone took your child from you. They stole his life. It's different when our own loved ones stole their own life from us, if that makes sense. But when someone is the perpetrator and takes your child from you, or your spouse or a sibling or parent, there is such anger. There is such rage at the system, especially when that person is never caught. So we need to be together.
Yeah, we do need this peer support model for a lot of different experiences. Is so important for people to give them hope that you can get through this. You can manage to heal, or you can manage just to cope, and keep going. And you
to
can
breathe.
Cope with some hope.
You know, cope, hope, all that stuff. Sometimes it's just, I'm here because I can't breathe. And just to take a breath. Sometimes we can't catch our breath. That's why if you look around the room when we're in a support group, so many people sigh. And that's a very normal reaction in grief because we can't catch our breath. It's really something. Yeah. It's as simple as that. What we went through is so hard. Nobody gets it, but we get it. We get it.
Yeah, and that's what this is all about. So we've been trying to provide a variety of different resources for people so they can kind of pick and choose what fits for them and what's helpful to them. And so it's been an interesting journey for me and for you. I just knew how tired I was when I had a single child, and I can't imagine with triplets how you had the energy to paint.
I know. Well, because I had to get up like energy. 2 hours later, so I figured I might as well stay up, and somebody's going to be crying in the middle of the night. So yeah, and that's why my hand hit the glass and it went all over. But that palette of grief really is what our grief looks like. It's a mess. Grief is messy, and it's complicated, and it's hard to figure out. But we're not alone in it, as I keep saying. And share your grief with others. Share your emotions and your thoughts and your spirituality. Just share it. Share it.
Right. So I thank you so much, Barbara, for being able to do this with us and to hear your voice after about 30 years or more. maybe about 35 years. I can't imagine. Oh, but I've always kept you in my thoughts, and I always remembered you and your books and that sort of thing. So I've always felt like I had a connection to you all these years, even though we haven't even talked that much. So any last minute comments, Susan, from you?
No, I just wanted to thank you, Barbara, so much for being here, and thank you everybody for coming. And I'll send you all a quick little email in a little bit with links and information about Barbara. And just thank you so much. It's been great meeting you and getting to know a little bit more about you. And I want to stay in touch. So let's stay in touch.
Thank you. I really appreciate
Absolutely.
it. And I will send, Marilyn, I'll send you, but I didn't say goodbye, Helping Families After Suicide, Susan. I'll send it to you as well. And you can share it with the group.
Oh, thank you. That
And
would be great.
Good.
my
Oh,
pleasure.
great.
Yeah, just stay
Oh,
healthy,
wow.
folks. This COVID-19 is scary.
It is.
Stay
It
healthy.
is.